So I'm going to start actually by inviting up two representatives from two of our partner organizations for tonight's event. Evan Leggett, who is Vice Chair of the Calgary Public Libraries Board, to welcome you, and Dr. James Allen, the Vice President Advancement of the University of Calgary. So Evan Leggett.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. I'm Evan Leggett, Vice Chair of the Calgary Public Library. On behalf of the library, I'd like to welcome you to Through the Multiverse, Queer Media Today, presented in partnership with the Calgary Institute for the Humanities. To begin today, we'll start with a land acknowledgement. With gratitude, mutual respect, and reciprocity, we acknowledge the ancestral home, culture, and oral teachings of the Treaty 7 people, which include the Siksika Nation, Piikani Nation, Kainai Nation, the Ita Stoney Nakoda Nation, consisting of the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Goodstoney bands, and the people of the Tsuut'ina Nation. We also recognize the Métis people of Alberta Region 3 who call Treaty 7 their home. At Calgary Public Library, we celebrate stories, the stories of the community and the land that we live on. We serve the community on Winchispa, Gustisi, and Mokinstis, which describes the gathering place where the Bow and Elbow Rivers meet. We respect all people who share, celebrate, and care for the Treaty 7 territory of Southern Alberta, and we honor the original caretakers of the land who remind us of the ongoing histories that precede us. We recognize our shared responsibilities going forward to help bring everyone together on this journey of truth and reconciliation. Thank you all for being here to celebrate Pride Week. We are proud to partner with the Calgary Institute for the Humanities on events like this and others as they help us to create and maintain vibrant spaces where everyone feels a sense of belonging. I invite you to learn more about the library and our ongoing commitment to equity, diversity, and inclusion. And while you're here, register for your free card if you haven't already. Tonight, we are honored to be hosting Dr. Amy Villarejo, Professor and Chair of the Department of Film, Television, and Digital Media at UCLA, who is here to discuss 2S LGBTQ+ representation in media. We hope you enjoy this evening's program, and we hope to see you at other great Pride programming hosted by the library this year, like talks with local historians, film screenings, and more. I'd like to now welcome up to the stage Dr. James Allen, VP of Advancement at the University of Calgary. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name's James. I'm the Vice President of Advancement at the University of Calgary, and I'm just delighted to be here. The topic this evening is near and dear to my heart. I have a former life as a queer media scholar myself, and so Amy and I were comparing notes earlier and figuring out who we know in common. It's a small world sometimes. But I'm here tonight in my capacity as someone who works in advancement at the university, and that's really one of the big things we do is alumni relations. The university has 220,000 alumni who live in 150 countries around the world, but about 75% of our alumni community lives here in Southern Alberta. And one of the things that we try to do is make sure that the sort of intellectual richness of the university is actually open and available to alumni across the city. And so tonight is one of those nights. And so, we're proud to sponsor this. We've in fact been sponsoring this particular lecture in sort of queer studies and queer history for the last 5 years. And I believe it's absolutely essential, particularly as Calgary grows and changes, that we talk about our history, talk about our queer existence, and the many, many different ways in which that reflects and reverberates through this city, this community. So really proud to be part of this. In fact, I'm a relatively recent arrival here in Calgary, and I landed about 1.5 years ago and was trying to find out what queer community meant here. And I very quickly found queer curling and queer lawn bowling. It's a thing I didn't know, but it's a thing. And was looking for things like this and was so excited to see that, in fact, the university was one of the places where you could find this kind of work. So I don't want to take up any more of your time, but really excited to have this and very excited for this evening's conversation. So Amy, over to you.
Oh, sorry.
Not Amy just yet. Still Jim. So thanks, Evan, and thanks, James, and thanks to all of you for coming. Before we begin, I would like to take a moment to express our solidarity with the queer community in Fort Macleod, which has been experiencing a barrage of hate lately. As you may have heard, a drag show last Saturday night was temporarily disrupted by teenagers who spread a noxious substance throughout the cinema, damaging the historic Empress Theatre. Earlier that day, their Pride Festival was disrupted by protesters and a prayer circle who interrupted the raising of the Pride flag. Later that night, the pole was cut down and the flag stolen. Our hearts go out to the queer community and their allies in Fort Macleod, although of course we've seen the same sort of thing here in Calgary, here in this library, in fact with extremists terrorizing children who attend drag queen story hours. I would like to take this opportunity to salute the extraordinary courage of the drag artists in Fort Macleod, in Calgary, and around the world, who have always been at the forefront of our struggle and who have always bravely decided that the show must go on. So with this lecture, we continue the University of Calgary's proud tradition of supporting the queer community from the 1960s onwards, in fact. The Calgary Institute for the Humanities is Canada's oldest humanities institute, founded at the University of Calgary in 1976. Our lecture series, now in the 5th year, started with a couple of lectures by groundbreaking queer scholars, historian George Chauncey, author of Gay New York, who spoke in 2019, and then in 2020, Lillian Faderman, author of Odd Girls and Twilight Lovers, and many other important works. Our 3rd year, during COVID, took the form of an online salon with 3 young Indigenous artist activists, Billy Ray Belcourt, Josh Whitehead, and Shawnee Kish. And last year, we welcomed you back into this space with the brilliant trans scholar, Jules Gill-Peterson. A lot of people have helped us to make it to our 5th year, and so I would like to thank some of the organizations and community members who have made tonight's lecture possible. So thanks especially to UC Advancement, to the alumni and the development teams, and in particular James Allen, Ben Fleury, who checked you in at the door, and Shannon Katusa in the Faculty of Arts. We're very grateful for the support of alumni who've been with us since the very first lecture and who are, as you've heard, one of the presenters of tonight's event. And thanks to Evan Leggett and to all of the team from the Calgary Public Library. The library is a civic treasure that we should all be proud of, and we're very happy to be here once again in this gorgeous building. Thanks to Gary Creevy, Registrar Emeritus at the university, who's been a source of advice and encouragement for this lecture from the beginning. To Kevin Allen of the Calgary Gay History Project, who's a great community resource and the writer of the CIH's Queer History Map. A very special welcome to Kevin's guest tonight, community pioneer Lois Szabo. Lois was one of the founders of the Carousel Club, or the Club Carousel, I don't know which it is, Calgary's first gay-owned club, which started in 1970. Thank you to Al Austin and the Austin Victor Fund at the Calgary Foundation, who have provided financial support, and to all of the other donors, and there are many who have made tonight possible. I'd welcome Dr. Aoife McNamara, the Dean of the Faculty of Arts, which is home to the Calgary Institute for the Humanities. And a welcome as well to Constable Ray Hosland, who I think is here, from the Calgary Police Services Diversity Resource Team. A big shout out to my co-organizer, Annette Tim, Professor of History and former editor of the Journal of the History of Sexuality, and Sean Lindsay at the CIH, who does much of the organizational lecture to get this lecture off the ground. So now it's my very great pleasure to introduce Dr. Amy Villarejo, who has literally written the book on queer film and television. I've been aware of Amy's work for a very long time, since the publication of an essay by her in 1999 in the groundbreaking collection Outtakes, Essays on Queer Theory in Film, which was really one of the first essay collections to use queer theory to look at film and television. Amy's essay, as it turned out, was an essay on a Canadian film, Forbidden Love, The Unashamed Stories of Lesbian Lives. Like me, Amy came of intellectual age at the time when queer theory was in its ascendancy, emerging in the academic world. And in that essay and in the book that followed, you could see this marked in the way that she ponders the word lesbian. Is lesbian a noun, or is it an adjective? Does it designate a fixed identity in the world, or an ongoing political project? Ultimately, she argued there, with respect to representation, and very beautifully, it designates the visualization of a possibility of something else. In the work that would follow, Dr. Villarejo would continue to ask searching and pointed questions about queer representation. In Ethereal Queer, Television, Historicity, Desire from 2014, Amy looks at the queer lives in the era of analog or broadcast television. Her interest is not so much in assessing whether these are good or bad representations, but in thinking about how transformations in television affected queer lives and how queer transformations in queer life affected television, what she calls the transmissions between television and queer life, and I expect there'll be a bit of a continuity of that tonight. While theoretically sophisticated, her analyses are always grounded in a sense of what this means for actual queer people and queer lives, her own included. So we hear of her faking illness in the 1970s so she could watch a film that she read about in TV Guide that featured lesbians. Elsewhere, we hear her wondering about why her favorite lesbian bar in Chicago was named after Katharine Hepburn, and then actually writing Katharine Hepburn a letter to see if she has any insight into why lesbians might have any attachment to her. Hepburn's response, she actually responded, and I paraphrase, was, "Are you insane?" I would have done a Hepburn accent, but I'm not much of an actor. In addition to these works and many other essays in all kinds of collections, she's the author of a very popular film studies textbook, Film Studies, The Basics, now in its third edition from Routledge, and of course the Oxford Handbook to Queer Cinema, co-edited with Ronald Gregg and published in 2021. Dr. Villarejo was for many years the Frederick J. Whitten Professor of Humanities at Cornell University. In 2020, she joined the faculty at UCLA in their renowned School of Theatre, Film, and Television, where she is currently chair. Tonight, she will be offering something of a State of the Queer Media Universe address. Please welcome Dr. Amy Villarejo.
Oh, you tall boys. All right, can you hear me? Calgary, thank you. What a treat to be here. Jim, thank you for the invitation. Thank you to the library for hosting this event, for opening your doors for a beautiful land acknowledgement, and I just want to add my voice to it. It's a delight to be here, and it's such an honor to present the 5th annual Calgary Institute for the Humanities LGBTQ2S plus lecture, and to follow in the wake of such distinguished and wonderful folks such as George Chauncey, with whose partner, Ron Gregg, I edited the Oxford Handbook to Queer Cinema slide, and shameless self-promotion. So thank you to everybody. So what I'm going to present today is a kind of image-heavy romp through queer film and television, but I am a professor after all, and so I occasionally opt for kind of obfuscating prose rather than straightforwardness. And so what I'd like to do is talk to you for about 45 minutes with a lot of clips and images, and then hear from you. I'm eager for your questions and conversation, and we can show more clips if you're interested. So that's the plan. Okay. Through the Multiverse was the title. It was generated by ChatGPT. Really, it was really generated by ChatGPT. I asked it to propose a way of addressing queer representation in film and television today, and it landed, I guess, on Everything Everywhere All at Once. Not without reason, right? Everything Everywhere is a film that is at its core propelled by queer desire. Stephanie Shu's character Joy wants her mother Evelyn, played by the luminous Michelle Yeoh, to be able to acknowledge her girlfriend. And she wants to introduce her girlfriend Becky to Evelyn's father, Joy's grandfather, Gong Gong, played by James Hong. The directors, Daniel Kwan and Daniel Scheinert, collectively known as Daniels, concoct a sci-fi martial arts genre-busting journey that takes Evelyn from icy tolerance with lines like, "You're very lucky your mother is open to you dating a girl," to real compassion for lesbian relations and the validation of Evelyn's love for her daughter. In fact, it would appear that the film's whole apparatus, from the very conceit of the multiverse, to the fanny packs, to the googly eyes, to the bagels, to the ridiculous hot dog fingers, exists in order to validate queer desire. As one reviewer says, you wouldn't know it from the trailers, but it's super gay. So here's where I want to start. This enormously successful film, winner of Oscars for Best Picture, Best Actress, Best Directors, Best Editing, and Best Supporting Actor, arises out of queer director Kwan's desire to tell the stories of the queer children of immigrant parents like Evelyn and Waymond. And yet almost no one calls it a gay film. Its gayness, we could say, is both ambient and invisible, causing a different reviewer to call it a sneakily emotional story of queer acceptance and family. That's not to say that the film's representation lacks power. To the contrary, another reviewer for the Gay Press found it to be, and I quote, the most forward-thinking and profound representation of the queer experience seen on screen in recent years, maybe ever, end quote. So for this reviewer, Holly Wong in the UK, it's really not hyperbole. As she explains, and I quote, queerness is an omnipresence in Joy's life that impacts all of her multiversal selves. Just like Evelyn's love for Waymond and Waymond's capacity for kindness, it's treated as something embedded into Joy's very fiber. And yes, as queer people, we know that to be true, but to see that represented so fiercely in a mainstream piece of cinema really transcends any other first queer kiss, sapphic yearning, or coming out scene I've seen on screen, end quote. So although the critic Wong focuses on Joy's character and her alter ego Jobu Tupaki, queerness bleeds beyond Joy's character in Everything, Everywhere, from Michelle Yeoh's kick-ass embodiment to her dreamy bonds with Jamie Lee Curtis's alliterative character, Deirdre Beaudeirdre. Curtis's vocal support for her real-life trans daughter has also infused her screen persona with queer positivity. So while Everything might therefore be said to be super gay in many ways, it also places Evelyn's journey at the center of its narrative. It is, to paraphrase the great Pedro Almodovar, all about the mother, and all about the straight mother and her transformation. And while ChatGPT finds a blockbuster Oscar winner on which to base its assessment of queer media today, I want to turn for the bulk of this presentation to a younger generation of independent makers who are exploring this ambient queerness through stories of queer becoming, often focused on adolescent or young adult characters, and in my final example, young adults in relation to a middle-aged lesbian. That would be my interest, right? So their worldview replaces stories of trauma, even stories of coming out, with experiences of affirmation and joyful togetherness. Think Heartstopper, the Netflix success described by one of its leads, Kit Connor, as just queer people being. And although now that we've seen season 2, which has a lot about coming out and a lot about disordered eating and complicated things, it's not just about affirmation, right? But affirmation is a huge part of what propels things like Heartstopper. So we're going to want to ask how this seamless queerness works across recent film and television, not just for our own recognition and pleasure, but affectively and politically in larger worlds, which is to say worlds closer to home than those of the multiverse. So one quick word on the idea of the multiverse, which is the idea that there are an infinite number of universes outside of our own observable one. These other universes contain infinite versions of our universe with every possibility of every conceivable event, choice, action, or scenario played out in them. You can watch Neil deGrasse Tyson explain this on YouTube if you're interested. He is pretty boring, yeah. And in filmmaking and in narrative storytelling, more specifically, it means something different, which is a way to explain multiple realities that exist within fictional universes. The idea that Michael Keaton and Ben Affleck both are Batman, right? Reconciling those kinds of things. And it's in this sense that Everything Everywhere seems to kind of adopt and endorse, allowing for a playful and visually stimulating traversal of different norms and rules in each of the multiverse layers. But what the multiverse doesn't explain or enable is the idea of value, or ways of adjudicating what worlds we want to build and inhabit and share. When we go through the concept of the multiverse I want to propose, we arrive instead at the concept of world making. World making is the idea whereby the world is nothing but multiple emergences, indeed multiple worlds, under different systems of observation, always mediated by representations, artistic interventions, and social practices. The thesis of world making replaces the notion of reality with the making of reality in an effort to emphasize that there is no self-identical world out there to be discovered. Instead, the world gets made in the very process of observation, of drawing distinctions. So our concepts matter, our ways of thinking matter, as much as what they help us to discover. And it's this active sense of queer world making happening in this room tonight, happening in community, that I want to explore in what follows. So Everything Everywhere cost about you can't really get exact numbers, but cost about $25 million in production and netted its parent studio, A24, an estimated $32 million US dollars. By contrast, the film I want to start with, Leroy, a short film directed by Marley Morrison in the UK in 2017, by my best guess, cost substantially less than 1/1000th of Everything Everywhere's budget, with funds raised on Kickstarter. Similarly interested in the experiences of queer children of immigrant parents, Leroy is set not in the sprawl of the San Fernando Valley in Los Angeles, where the laundromat of Everything Everywhere is actually located and where I happen to live, but on a bleak council estate in North London, where eccentric teenager Leroy Brown, played by Nathan Bryan, and did the name come from the Jim Croce song? I'm not sure, but thank you. And here's the kind of log line for the film: spends his days fighting with his wannabe gangsta brother Kenny, making his own jewelry, and playing an amusement arcade dance game with best friend Yukiko. The visual and affecting wonders of Leroy exceed that blurb in myriad ways, not least in the homage that it offers to Dance Dance Revolution, the aforementioned arcade game. So let me show you the trailer.
This is the last tape Grandad left me.
Which one are you going to carry the coffin?
I'll do it.
Obviously me. Leroy's probably going to drop him.
Okay, Leroy, you will do the speech then.
I have no experience in public speaking.
You'll be fine, just speak from the heart.
I speak from something that's broken.
Sorry about your granddad. If it makes you feel any better, we all thought he was going to die ages ago.
This is Yukiko.
Konnichiwa.
Never say that to me again.
She doesn't like that.
Leroy!
Look at why Leroy.
So the narrative is simple. Leroy's grandfather, Nelson, has died, and Leroy's mother delegates the family eulogy to Leroy. In the days leading up to the memorial, Leroy flirts with a gay caregiver orderly named Glenn, who cared for Nelson, and he brainstorms with his best friend Yukiko about what he's going to do or say in front of his Caribbean family at the service. Unlike the elaborate set pieces and martial arts battles of Everything Everywhere, Leroy quietly unfolds a kind of landscape of the everyday. By that I mean that the film, its characters, and their actions are all resolutely located in this urban, working-class, mixed-race environment. The film opens, as you saw, with the family car moving through the London neighborhood, almost mapping the sense of belonging at stake in its narrative. And the film visits each of its locations in an immersive, sensory style that sees character and setting as co-constituted in luminous ways. We see that in the arcade with Glenn and Leroy standing at the game where you push the coins, right, to make them fall over, and exchange a little flirtation. I should mention, by way of some context for the racial politics of this film in the UK, that this year, 2023, is the 75th anniversary of the Windrush, the wave of immigration named after the ship, the Empire Windrush, that initially brought Caribbean workers to the UK with the promise of integrating these imperial subjects as English citizens, a promise that went, as you probably all know, violently unfulfilled, and that led to the most significant racial conflicts in the UK of the latter part of the 20th century. So Windrush has come to mean anything from scandal to betrayal, but certainly always indexes racism. And so within this admittedly fraught landscape, unfold a number of choreographies, again, not of the spectacular visual transformations of the everywhere multiverse, but of the minor and meaningful acts of tribute and affiliation that Leroy enacts. Leroy establishes its characters visually and boldly.
This is the last tape Grandad left me.
We'll just get Sean. Yeah, Sean, come help. Thank you. Okay, so Leroy establishes its characters visually and boldly. Leroy's afro and Yukiko's sunglasses. Just without, yeah, next.
This is the last tape.
Brilliant. Okay, so I can just do that. Just keep going. Okay. They become almost a visual signature of the film's style. The writer-director Morrison builds these characters further through minimal but telling and often hilarious dialogue. Leroy's elevated diction is played for a laugh when his mother asks him to be the one to speak at his grandfather's service. He says that he has no experience in public speaking. As you saw, it says so on my curriculum vitae. When Glenn invites Leroy to his party, Leroy responds that he'd planned to be at home making his jewelry, and he refers to one of the mood rings he's just made as one of his bespoke pieces. And when at Glenn's party, he leans wearing his cool brother's favorite hoodie on a wet shelf, he declares his arm over and over again to be moist, which is one of my favorite words. So if Dance Dance Revolution signals a late 1990s vibe for the film, which avoids making any clear indication of its time frame, so too does the cassette mixtape, which saw its heyday in the 1990s too. As the plot reveals that Granddad Nelson had a regular practice of making mixtapes for Leroy, Leroy pops Nelson's final tape into his boombox and begins to dance out on the asphalt with cinematography that inevitably tracks his body from his dancing timberlands up to his face, intercut with him exploring the same moves in his bedroom in his underwear. Rehearsing his moves with Yukiko then in the interior of the bowling alley arcade, the two of them spot a glorious one-piece jumpsuit with a lightning bolt in gold on black. Looking at it, and there it is. Electrifying, says Leroy, transfixed. It's on offer as a prize for arcade points, in this case, the outrageous sum of 5,000. You'll have to play Star Quest 643 times, Yukiko says. But Yukiko, of course, gets the jumpsuit for Leroy, and he's on his way to dancing rather than verbally delivering a eulogy for his granddad. So we should think about costume for more than a moment. The jumpsuit enters as a garment that would appear to be transformative, to grant Leroy a kind of superpower, as would a superhero costume, to dance and to appear before his family as queer and through his own expressive capacities, his dance. But the superhero costume is simply an allegory for the power of costume more generally, to reveal to an actor and to an audience the essence of their shared humanness. My UCLA colleague, Deborah Landis, an Oscar-nominated costume designer and historian of Hollywood costume, is reluctant even to use the word character to describe how costume functions, preferring to think instead about how words on the screenplay, because there are no pictures in screenplays, right? How words on the screenplay page transform into human flesh and image. Something I like, I'm interested in that. And for queers, fashion, costume, and style all reveal the complicated interplay of outsiderness and belonging, of marking oneself as different and recognizing queer affinity. In Leroy, Glenn's streak of blue hair, something we learn Nelson to have encouraged, marks his own boldness as much as it signals to Leroy that Glenn is one of us. Costume also works as citation when in Leroy's dance eulogy, Yukiko drapes a blazer over his jumpsuit, a la James Brown, whose cape routine and his please, please, please number became a staple of his performances. And footnote, there's a lot of debate about the significance of that cape, like weirdly, I don't know why people are sort of fixated on pinning down what it means. But for me, there's something fundamental about vulnerability and power at work in it, where Brown for a minute reveals his fragility and then kind of supercharges into an even more heightened vocal performance. So Leroy, the film, concludes with his own performance, and director Morrison wisely withholds the joyous approval of family, friends, co-worshipers for a couple of beats, letting all of us rest in a moment of anticipation that can be both fearful and hopeful. The ending is by no means ambivalent, however. It screams, "Yes, Leroy," in a profound declaration of queer style, queer expression, and like Heartstopper, queer being. It's on the internet. You can watch the whole film when you get home tonight. I hope you will. So Morrison's first feature, Sweetheart, released in 2021, likewise aims for affirmation, but as befits a longer film, Morrison complicates the narrative of gender and sexual identity that forms the core of this story through sustained inquiry into its complex characters. Like Leroy, a log line is just a condensed way of describing a film's project, right? So the log line appears deceptively simple. Quote, "A socially awkward, environmentally conscious teenager named AJ is dragged to a coastal holiday park by her painfully normal family, where she becomes unexpectedly captivated by a chlorine-smelling, sun-loving lifeguard named Isla." So in addition to this lesbian sexual awakening, there are gender identity issues in Sweetheart having to do with testing and undoing certain norms of embodiment, but they're subdued in relation to the film that Morrison thought she would be initially making under the auspices of Film London's Microwave Initiative, which funds first features up to £100,000. That film, according to Morrison, both angrier and more politically charged than what Sweetheart became, derived from Morrison's own experience of not transitioning. As she puts it in an interview in The Guardian, it was a long process, going to clinics, going through all that, and then deciding it wasn't for me. It wasn't making me feel good about myself. So I had this complete shift where I thought I was going one way, but then I backtracked. And as if to reassure herself, she says, and that's totally fine. Surprisingly, there's little in the way of scholarship on aborted or failed transition. I can think of only one example. Maybe you'll have others. The Stanford anthropologist and Guggenheim scholar Lachlan Jane's forthcoming book, My Failed Transition, which uses transition as a kind of ethnographic field and does a kind of autoethnography. There's plenty of fuel, as you all know, for right-wing outrage in transitions gone wrong, but there's also overwhelming evidence that most who undergo hormonal and surgical transition report satisfaction, and more bizarrely, even than knee and hip surgery. So Sweetheart, the film that Morrison wrote as a replacement for the earlier screenplay, becomes a place, I think, to work on some of these trans issues in a softer key, where there's room for both ambivalence and ambiguity. Nell Barlow's performance of the 17-year-old protagonist, AJ, earned Barlow a breakthrough award from the British Academy of Film and Television Arts, a designation that identifies the next generation of creative talent and nurtures these performers. It's really well-deserved. Barlow gives us a tour de force embodiment of adolescent yearning, rage, bravado, awkwardness, and tenderness. AJ, against her teenaged will, is brought along to the family's annual week in a Dorset holiday park organized by her mother, Tina, and accompanied by her 9-year-old sister, Dana. They meet AJ's older sister, a very pregnant and very self-involved Lucy, and her partner, Steve, a genial and all-around supportive guy. So let me show you the
Huh? What are you doing, huh?
Cows! You do realise that the breeding of cows is like the #1 cause of deforestation?
What? I don't like the spelling of your name.
Right, I'm gonna go and check us in. Are you coming?
Why do you guys all just look the same?
What's the Wi-Fi code?
There isn't any Wi-Fi.
I was perfectly fine at home, but Mum insisted.
You spend all your money.
Where's my dead Jesus jumper?
You can be gay and,
Here we go.
look like a girl.
Why can't I just do what I want to do?
Because it changes every 5 minutes. That's why. Like your hat?
Like normal.
Thanks. I'm Isla, by the way.
AJ. They all look so happy, like they exist in some parallel universe.
What is wrong with you?
I'm 17, everything's wrong with me.
I've never seen anyone wear so many clothes to the beach.
Girls like you always have boyfriends.
Girls like me.
Why can't you just say it? Say what?
AJ, please. AJ. AJ, wait!
I knew you'd ruin this holiday for everyone. You always do.
Life is not fun all the time.
I like you a lot.
This is your holiday too, you know. You're allowed to enjoy yourself.
Sometimes I have no idea who I am.
That's the thing about being on holiday. You get to be whoever you want to be.
All I know is things are different now.
What's the plan and what are you thinking of doing?
Indonesia.
Indonesia?
There's a charity out there you can volunteer. You knit jumpers for elephants.
All right, it's quirky. So Morrison has room in the feature to develop contradictory and complex family members and dynamics, cocooned in this holiday park where on the one hand, there is no way out, but where on the other, one can reinvent oneself daily and fantastically amidst fellow strangers, vacationers, and park employees. And what a cultural, visual, ideological feast the holiday park provides, from the laundrette machines where AJ first meets her enamorada, Isla, to the caravans, pools, evening entertainments, and umbrella drinks that establish the middle class, mostly white environment of the park. But as with Leroy, Morrison is not content to replicate a white world, even if that is what she is both painting and skewering. In Sweetheart, Lucy and Steve, who's Afro-British, provide a kind of mixed-race mirror or maybe even aspirational pole for AJ and Isla. As with Leroy, Morrison is smart about visual economy, sketching the genders of her family members with clear visual detail from which deviation then becomes memorable or significant. AJ wears this kind of trademark outfit consisting of a bucket hat, rose-colored glasses belying her cynical and protected perspective, and black Chuck Taylors. Mom Tina has a no-nonsense, normative, and yet aspirational, girly kind of vision for AJ and for herself that she fulfills on a final night at the park's disco when she gets sparkly and drunk, while Dana, in spectacles and braided hair, is a nerdy and loquacious kid who might just be a miniature for the nerdy, learned part of AJ. Lucy's feminine cred is proven by her hairstylist job and voluptuously pregnant embodiment, but her embrace of AJ at a particularly tense moment in the narrative reveals the ruse or the limits of her self-absorption and her touching capacity for empathy. Of the four of these women characters, and I'm going to put that in quotations, AJ begins by declaring their resistance to female gender through the name AJ. Through a refreshing revision on cancel culture and the moral purity of rejecting dead names, AJ comes to test, not to accept, but to test what it means to inhabit the name their mother gave them, April Jane. I'm not minimizing the power of naming, but instead embracing the film's commitment, amplified, I think, by certain strains of trans and queer theory, to preserve the historically variable and mutable categories and their attendant gendered and sexual life that are at stake in these representations. Morrison, the director, no less than writers like Jack Halberstam or Maggie Nelson, is a theorist of the instability of the category, how it might be fungible, frail, and undependable, especially when it's tethered to adolescent experience. As Halberstam puts it in the short book Trans, I want to chart the undoing of certain logics of embodiment. When logic that fixes bodily form to social practice comes undone, when narratives of sex, gender, and embodiment loosen up and become less fixed in relation to authenticity, originality, and identity, then we have the space and time to imagine bodies otherwise. Filmmakers who craft their worlds precisely out of space and time are in a privileged position to help us do that work of untethering. In Sweetheart, Morrison uses a number of devices to build and explore AJ's contradictions. Especially in its first half hour, the film relies upon AJ's voice and voiceover to guide our understanding of their experience, in which questions of gender and sexuality loom large, but don't dwarf other fundamental aspects of adolescence. And you heard a little bit of this in the trailer. In one voiceover, AJ says, "Mom says I was supposed to have been a boy called Aaron. I think about him sometimes and how much easier his life would have been." This, as we watch the changing of the lifeguards at the Holiday Park pool, where a lanky, wavy-haired lad we will soon meet as Nathan takes over the stand, the lifeguard stand, with a kind of masculine ease and bro charm. AJ, hiding behind their glasses and hat, feels a little bit more like a frightened turtle, out of sorts and uncomfortable. Outside of the ladies' dressing room with her younger sister Dana, a woman pushes by AJ and stares. People stare at me a lot. They always have. While the narrative supplies other evidence of childhood gender trouble, of taunting, of teasing, of alienation, Morrison doesn't insist on a strict causality between then and now. That is, AJ went through some stuff that many queer and trans young adults have faced, but it isn't marked as trauma in the sense that it isn't indelible and it isn't immutable. Indeed, in a funny sequence that follows upon these scenes collated around the ladies' room, AJ unpacks the holiday luggage only to discover that Mother Tina has populated it with the most hideous, floral, girly, and otherwise completely inappropriate clothing for the gender that AJ is or is becoming. A funny exchange follows, one that you saw here in part, one that Morrison herself recounts as autobiographical and is probably familiar to many of us. Tina observes, just because you're a lesbian now doesn't mean you have to dress like a boy all the time. Whereupon Lucy seizes upon Jodie Foster as a lesbian who dresses nicely, and AJ leaves the caravan fuming, Joan of Arc was locked up for wearing the wrong clothes. The film thus balances an acknowledgement that the choice of one's clothing feels monumentally important to a 17-year-old who can, moreover, think grandly of oneself as one with Joan of Arc, with a gentle recognition that someone has to buy the clothes and wash them. Indeed, AJ is on their way to the park's laundrette, where they meet Isla in the flesh. I like your hat, says Isla. I like your whistle, says AJ, charmingly and awkwardly. That evening at a party, AJ muses about Isla's coworkers, and this was kind of patched onto another image in the trailer. They all look so happy, like they exist in some parallel universe where everything is amazing. I don't think I've ever looked that happy in my entire life. What the actual fuck is wrong with me? Soon enough, AJ discovers the secret to their happiness, drink and drugs, and sheds the existential angst in favor of a kind of playful participation in a world putatively straight, social, fun, from which AJ had felt entirely excluded. And while I'm aware that doing shots with a lifeguard named Elvis doesn't quite suggest complex queer theory, but I'm going to make a leap. I'm reminded during these hallucinatory party sequences of Paul Preciado's arguments about the pharmacological nature of sexuality and gender, that it's less about identities and authenticity than about technologies of the body that involve hormones, drugs, flows, what the trans author Jordi Rosenberg has called the molecularization of sexuality. Through the cliches of a teenager getting drunk and coming home far after curfew, we can perceive something, I think, about alteration, about transition and transformation that's acutely important to the trans exploration in Sweetheart. And maybe the final thing to observe about Sweetheart is that AJ not only gets the girl, but gets to gain confidence and contentment along the way, in that gentle smile in the last image that you saw. Of her narrative choices, Morrison says, a lot of the time being young and queer can be such a lonely place. You're always wondering, is that person gay or not? But I'm saying to young gay girls, what if the people you fancy are not running away from you? What if indeed they are ambiently there, available, open, and loving? Sweetheart allows for a union that also helps AJ to think gender. From hating the name April Jane, who the fuck wants to be called that, to experimenting with it, not abandoning the transness of AJ, but also loosening ties to the certainty of its fit. AJ sticks sartorially with baggy pants and billowy button-down shirts over t-shirts, but over the course of the film, they've also tried out a floral shift and a pretty good Hawaiian shirt. And in the short lovemaking sequence with Isla toward the end of the film, Morrison's camera loses itself in bodies and pleasures in a way that hesitates to define roles or gendered aspects of sexuality. I've hesitated to use the young adult label for Sweetheart, but it comes closer to being a teen movie than some of its peers that are similarly interested in masculinity or in gender nonconformity. I'm thinking, for example, of Desi Akhavan's Appropriate Behavior, Dee Reese's Pariah, Celine Sciamma's short film Tomboy, or even Olivia Wilde's Booksmart. I'm not using the teen label pejoratively. I'm wanting to notice how tightly Sweetheart keeps its focus on AJ and the young workers at the park, keeping even AJ's family members at arm's length almost all of the time. The exception to this distance is the mom, Tina, who gets to have a little bit of drunken fun with the resident magician and who works through some of her worries about AJ by the film's conclusion. So thus far, I've identified the preoccupation with a non-traumatic, ambient queerness in films that nonetheless unfold in the space of the nuclear family, and that in focusing on sons and daughters, associate queerness mostly with youth. So in my final minutes, I'd like to turn to a film that really tries to bridge generations of queers by locating its interest entirely outside of the heteropatriarchal family. Erica Sarmay's A Wild Patience has taken me here. And here's the logline description. This formally innovative, euphorically sexy short travels through the queer Brazil of past, present, and future as it traces an encounter between an older butch biker and a band of young, polyamorous lesbians who share an ecstatic weekend together. It's great. Let me offer a longish origin story from its maker. And this, Erica translated this from Portuguese, so it's a little awkward. I started imagining A Wild Patience in my head about 6 years ago. For this, I had some units of desire. I knew that it would be about lesbian bonding, but I didn't want to make yet another work that equates queerness with youth. I also didn't want to reinforce the cliche of romantic monogamous love that predominates in most films and shows about lesbians. One image that instigated me deeply was the figure of the 50-something-year-old protagonist. I remember thinking I had never seen a film starring a lesbian in this age bracket. And by that, I don't mean it doesn't exist, it just means I haven't seen it, in which you are no longer young, but also not old enough to be an elderly person. I found that charming. As in adolescence, you're kind of in between, and the in-betweens can be great points of contact. She continues, just 2 more sentences. At that time, I lived in Rio de Janeiro, and I paid my bills working as the producer of the 2 main sapphic parties in the city. What I loved most about it was the powerful networks of affection and partnerships that would form in those spaces. I wanted the film to archive the joys of that time, our strong sense of community, and the intensity of bodies in motion that only a good party can offer, end quote. So A Wild Patience thus combines loose narrative with this archival impulse to document and celebrate the city's queer histories. It's a dual impulse. On the one hand, to display actual archival materials such as photographs, animations, vlogs, and testimonials that link contemporary queer experience to those who paved the way, often under circumstances of repression and fear in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. On the other hand, the film itself archives Rio and the adjacent city of Niterói, just across the harbor, and Sarmay's hometown, conserving for posterity and the next generation the particular character of pleasure and intensity of the moment. Sarmay's casting, furthermore, is also itself an archive of queerness. They insisted on casting queer actors for all of the roles, with famed Brazilian singer Zélia Duncan in the role of Vange, who does not avoid the cliche of being a cat lesbian, and the four musketeers of the polyamorous lovers, Ro, played by Bruna Linsmeyer, who is a very successful telenovela actress, Alice, played by Camila Roja, Angela, played by Lori Mota, a non-binary trans actor, and Granado, played by Sarney's own collaborator, Clarissa Ribeiro. So just as the group of young polyamorous queers incessantly documents themselves twerking and grinding on their smartphones, unapologetically performing for each other and for the camera, Sarmé turns her camera in order to linger on a quality of experience that one can only characterize as joy or freedom, or perhaps both. And let me show you the trailer.
Ninguém é destinada ou condenada a amar, seja quem for.
Tá sozinho? Hã? Você tá sozinha?
Tô. Antigamente, isso aqui era um bar e eu vim aqui com as minhas amigas. Mas você não tava aqui não.
Eu transo com a Ana Carolina, eu caso com a Martinalha e aí eu posso matar a Betânia.
Quê? Ah, não, gente, quem isso que vocês só mata a Betânia?
Mas no meu tempo, a gente não saía na rua dando beijo na boca, fazendo o que dá na cabeça, não. Era realmente outra época.
Ah, essa não é a sua época.
Okay, so I just want to focus for a minute on, you saw a couple images here of the motorcycle ride where Ro meets Vange at the bar of a lesbian club and approaches her as Vange gets on her motorcycle to ride home. "Can I come?" she asks simply, and Vange acquiesces. For more than a minute of a film that runs for under a half hour, Sarmé allows them just to ride, to take in the night's air and changing light, and to feel each other on the seat of a bike. And here are just some images from that. It's a gorgeous sequence. So on the soundtrack, we hear the film's version of the song Noite Preta, which you just heard closing out the trailer, which translates to Black Night, a song that had been made popular by Vange's namesake, Vange Lionel, a real-life singer, writer, and lesbian activist who died from ovarian cancer in 2014. Zélia Duncan's Vange, the character, is a tribute to Vange Lionel, and this version of Noite Preta is in fact sung by Zélia. After the bike ride, we cut neither to the lovemaking scene that we assume follows, nor to waking up the next morning, but instead to Vange's delivery of Ro back home to the home she shares with her partners, into which Vange is invited for a drink. No romantic coupling, just the conviviality of the multiple. That conviviality extends to Vange, whom the four welcome easily. And while Vange seems keenly aware of her age and the difference between what went down in her time, more closeted, more fear, the younger folks refuse the cleavage between then and now. "It really was a different time," Vange says, sitting at the table. "Isn't this your time?" they ask. In some coverage of Wild Patients in the North American press around the time of its screening at Sundance in 2022, reviewers were keen to emphasize the comparatively progressive situation in Brazil with regard to LGBTQ rights, compared to the United States and Canada, where there are far fewer NGOs and advocacy organizations. Some also commented on the racially diverse scene the film portrays, aware of how much more segregated and racially charged are the queer social scenes in some North American cities. When I hosted Erica, the filmmaker, and another queer Brazilian graduate student this year in Los Angeles, it took a while for them to get out of West Hollywood and discover East LA, where they had a sense of being back home. Not one reviewer, however, noticed that Sarmé made this film under fascism, that is, under the repressive regime of Jair Bolsonaro, who makes the culture wars of Donald Trump and Ron DeSantis looks like child's play. I mention this because the film's dual emphases that I just cited, its love of multiplicity, many characters, many lovers, many dancers, many perspectives, and its refusal to cleave past from present, from future, are, from the perspective of national politics, what I want to see as a kind of contemporary Brazilian queer anti-fascism. The articulation of those politics comes most forcefully for me in the film's closing montage, which means that I'm mostly going to skip over the several-minute-long, highly stylized orgy that is a really important element of the film's formal experimentation. I'll just say that it's quite beautiful and intentionally careful to avoid pornographic depictions of eroticized bodies. Sarmé spent 10 years studying pornography. She knows of what she speaks and makes, and tries to generate a very different image of bodies in contact. Sarmé intercuts the actors at the end of the film, delivering partial lines, fragments of identity and observation, rather than arguments or fully constructed positions. These intermingle, seeming to complete one another or to take us elsewhere, commenting on cinema itself, on the film's own ambitions, or on the experiences of the actors' characters, or on lesbian life more generally. There's an awareness of the political nature of image making and on the political appearance of gendered and sexualized bodies, heightened in the moment of Bolsonaro, who was at that same time taking money earmarked for graduate student grant support and funneling it toward his reelection campaign, literally stealing it from the university. So here are the fragments, and they're up here in very small print. I know you can't read them. We are here to overcome the tradition of silence. The lesbian body is invisible. This is not somewhere else, but here. We have to remember. I called myself a dyke. In our country, this culture oppresses, invisible to cinema, a country moving closer, silences, and destroys. How am I seen, marginalized for its own way of making people disappear? My Black body is an armor. Those who don't call themselves that. I had a girlfriend with the power of invisibility. I want to be visible for Black dykes. My dyke voice gained power, the conditions of my visibility when I was with her, to build bridges. How I look at her, I was invisible too. How I look at a film, just because we love each other. In the film's final frames, there is also an address toward the past and to the future, an explicit acknowledgement of the intergenerational dependencies and potentialities that propel the film's narrative. It contains an index also of the trans awareness that infused the film, where a dedication to the women who came before is crossed out and replaced by people. It feels like a fitting conclusion to this paper as well. This broadcast, this paper, is dedicated to the women, crossed out, the people who came before us, the ones that are here and understand what we're doing, and those who don't understand too. And for those of you who will come after us, come. We have a lot to talk about. I thank you and look forward to questions.
See if these mics work. Well, thank you for that lovely snapshot of where we are right now. We have time for questions. I want to perhaps start by asking about these new possibilities for representation and the new lives. Is this partly about the maturity of our community and the fact that we've told some of these stories? Does it also have to do with new medias and new systems of circulation and new technologies and new possibilities there? Do those two things go together?
Absolutely. I mean, what's so exciting to me about someone like Marley Morrison, someone like Erica Sarmé, is that they're making work that begins with nothing, right? As so many independent artists have done in the past. That is not new, right? But it's finding roots that wouldn't have existed before, right? It's finding distribution on the internet. It's finding funding on Kickstarter. It's finding a fusion between academic thinking and image making that's also really exciting. And so the sense that we've come a long way and that we're enabled by the past is particularly, I think, touching to Sarmé, right? Who sort of wants to tell a story of, like all of you, those who have come before. Right? And to pay homage, to love the community that they've generated and to nurture it into new possibilities. So I think it's not only the maturity of the community or the kind of growth of the community, but a really conscious sense of what ties us to the past and how our indebtedness propels us forward.
Are there questions up here? I can run the mic up. A second question I want to just follow on that.
Yep.
While you people are thinking of questions.
Oh, they have questions. I've
is
seen
about
their
the kind of circulation that we now have that's much greater in the past. It seemed kind of unidirectional. We watch TV, it transmitted to us. Now there are whole ecosystems of response and communities back and forth. And is that affecting the kinds of stories as well, that there is much greater circulation before the final product appears, and of course even after the final product, in the endless recap shows of Drag Race and so on,
right?
That then get reworked back in.
Yeah, there's no question. And I'm less interested, I mean, there are plenty of people who do wonderful work on fan communities and the way that fan communities recycle, regenerate, and engage with popular culture. I'm way more interested in these minor moments that can make it to Sundance, right? That can make it to international stages. So she's a graduate student, right, Erica, at the University of São Paulo. It's a little underfunded little nightmare, right? And yet she's taken this energy of the town that she comes from, Niterói, and has made it into something that has reached an international stage. And I think that that's remarkable, and she's continuing to make work.
Okay, now it's really your turn. I've asked two questions. Okay, there we are at the back.
And by the way, this is the first, I wrote this paper for you. It's the first time I've given it, and I'm going to give it again in a couple weeks in Rochester. And so I could really use your feedback, right? Like if there were moments that you really snoozed, please tell me, or moments that you wanted to know more about. I'd love to know that too.
Thank you for your story and all the wisdom that you shared with us. I took a queer film history class in my undergrad, and we focused a lot on movies kind of before 2000, like the early 2000s.
Yeah.
And about like how queer people were portrayed as either ending up dead or the villain or killed or things like that.
Yep.
And so after seeing these stories about queer joy, I'm wondering why you think that now we're seeing so many more of those stories than we ever did before, because it's so refreshing not be portrayed as like the villain. And yeah.
Great question. That's what interests me, right? I mean, that's why I was drawn to these films that really refuse the stories of demonization and trauma. They're just like, no, I'm not telling that story again. It's been told, I understand it, but that's not what I'm doing, right? I'm going to do this other thing. And, you know, Jim's really moving introduction about Fort Cloud helps us to remember that trauma and violence are everywhere, right? It is not about denying that trauma and violence affect us, our people, daily. That is real, and it's intensifying, and it's horrible, and we need to organize and work even harder, right? But the need to affirm, to nurture, to collectively raise other emotional possibilities seems strong right now. And I think that that's what some of these young folks who are making this work now are engaged in, right? Trying to find a different emotional register, a different political register to do some of the work that seems so urgent at this moment.
Hi, thank you very much. As a queer media academic, how do you deal with the volume of media? Like, it's twofold, right? There's way more produced, generally speaking.
Yep.
And there's way more queer representation in the media that is produced. It's like a meta increase.
You publish 800-page books, like, right? I mean, that's what the Oxford book is trying to do, right? Like, look at everything, right? Here's all of queer media. No, the real answer is that you can't, right? You can't take it all in, can't watch everything. You certainly can't think deeply about everything. You pick the things that give you traction intellectually, politically, emotionally, personally even. I love seeing Zalia Duncan on the screen in her luminosity in this role where she is a huge, huge star in Brazil, okay? A huge musical star in Brazil. And she took this role for no money, right? An out lesbian engaged in this kind of crazy polyamorous weekend with these young women. Right? It was just super risky, right? But it's also really brave and really beautiful. And I wanted to affirm that and show her to you, right? So it's sort of about, for me, making choices often about what's not getting talked about. So there, you know, I've written stuff on, say, Transparent, right? I wrote a long piece on Transparent for Film Quarterly. It got a lot of attention. It was a big, huge breakout production. But I'm way more interested in elevating some of the things that you're not likely to know about, that you can in fact go see, right, when you go home, and think about and encounter new and different kinds of media than commercial stuff. And I have to say that being in Los Angeles for 3 years has only intensified my sense that I want to run from big commercial media, right? Because at my job, that's what I do, right? But in my own thinking, I'm really interested in smaller, more minor ways of making art.
Amy, thank you so much for that really wonderful talk. I really, really enjoyed it. Because I do children's and young adult literature, I was really, really interested in the thread in your talk that's about the relationship between queerness and youth.
Yep.
And you had a really beautiful phrase in there where you talk about Morrison as a theorist of the instability of the category, especially as tethered to the adolescent experience.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering what you make of this kind of cultural desire to so frequently tether queerness to adolescence. It's almost as though in most cases, I mean, you mentioned Heartstopper in your talk as well. We can only kind of imagine a queer coming of age as being an adolescent experience when, you know, many of us as adults practically know that's not the case.
Right.
So I'm wondering, you know, why you think that is, where that comes from, why are queerness and youth and adolescence tethered so closely in the popular imagination, and are there any other amazing examples in addition to the short film that you mentioned that kind of defy these tropes or conventions, I guess we could say?
Yeah, thank you. It's a wonderful question. I don't have a big answer. I mean, I have a genre answer that the genre of the coming of age story works really nicely for queer coming of age. Rom-com seems to be pretty amenable to, you know, queer storytelling in a way that seems very benign and often kind of uninteresting. What I liked about what Erica says about the origins of A Wild Patience, when she says that middle age is also a kind of becoming, right? Where she says you're not yet elderly, like that. She kind of finds that seam in someone who maybe has a character who has her own history, but who's then open to something completely new, right? And becomes, but doesn't become in the sense of coming out or newly identifying as queer, whatever, but becomes, right? Is in a state of transition and of learning and of opening and of, you know, new experience. And that interests me, like, because I think that that's the piece of the adolescent experience that we find so powerful, right? When the AJ character asks her mother, you know, her mother asks her, why are you so miserable? And her answer is, I'm 17, right? So, you know, that piece of it, that poignancy, is very charming, but it doesn't have to be tied to adolescence. So I'm very interested in that question.
Other questions around here? Right here.
Have you thought about, like, if you made a film, what it would be about?
Oh, that's an awesome question. I've only made one film when I was in graduate school, and it was essentially a tribute to women cowboys. Yeah, cowgirls. Yeah, but some of them weren't really girls, and sort of inspired by your very own Katie Lang. Yeah. Yeah. So I am not a filmmaker. I had to learn how to do video editing when I was in grad school, and I'm amazed now to be in a school where I predominantly teach filmmakers. I spent 23 years at Cornell teaching scholars, mostly PhD students and undergraduate students in the liberal arts, and now I'm teaching cinematographers, animators, screenwriters, documentarians, narrative filmmakers, and I love it.
Do you know of any queer stories regarding seniors where they may have led a very conventional marriage life and then in their later years may discover each other and what they really want? Like, I don't know, once they're in a care home or you know, once their spouses have passed away, something like that?
Yeah, I can send you a list. I'm because there's a lot to watch. And they're really, you know, they're like weird. I'm very fond of this weird little movie called Losing Chase that stars Helen Mirren, the divine Helen Mirren, as a middle-aged woman who falls in love with a younger woman and sort of is transformed by that lesbian experience late in life. The younger woman is played by Kira Sedgwick. It's set on Martha's Vineyard. It's very beautiful. There's a lot of lobsters. and boats bobbing in the harbor. You know, it's a very lovely film. But if you would give me your email address or send me a note, I would be happy to help you plan some screenings.
Well, unfortunately, because of our late start, we've kind of come to the end of the time we had allotted for the Q&A, and I do, because this is a Pride event, want to leave time for queer conviviality.
Yes.
We do have a reception up there with snacks and drinks
Mini
that are for sale.
hamburgers.
And mini hamburgers, wee little hamburgers. Yeah, not
She
for the
prefers
elderly.
to call them mini
Yes.
hamburgers.
So do please stick around and join us for join us for drinks and conversation, and you can have more questions to Dr. Villarejo. But before we go up there, I would just like to thank once again the people I thanked before who helped this lecture get off the ground, principally the library and UC Alumni and Engagement. But I would especially like to thank Dr. Amy Villarejo for this lovely snapshot of where we are now and perhaps where we are going.
Thank you so much. Thank you all.